Today I want to talk to you a little bit about project checkpoint 1. So this is the Canvas page for the course, and you can see that you're going to have your exam, practice exam, a project checkpoint, and that's your first checkpoint for this project. So let's look at project checkpoint 1. That's right here. Okay. Um, so for this project, kind of determining an appropriate type of project really depends on um, what type of data you're utilizing, and in specific the data types. Okay. Um, I'm going to discourage you from doing one of these last two analyses with a Kaplan-Meier um, curve. You could do the reliability analysis if you like. Um, so that is very related to engineering, understanding survival times. However, these two topics are not covered in your Xi book. Okay. The types of analysis that are covered are going to be multiple linear regression right here, where typically you need to have at least one numerical x and a categorical y. You can actually do the multiple linear regression with categorical inputs, um, but there's often a different analysis that's performed in its place when you do that. Um, Now, if you have two inputs, so categorical X with just two inputs and a numerical response Y, then you could compare the two populations using a bootstrap um, type analysis and a confidence interval. Um, Often in this case, in which there is just one, in which there's just one categorical input, and that input happens to be binary, only two categories. I often tell people that they can do the two sample t-test over the bootstrap, um, just as the comment, just as a comment. The bootstrap is covered in this course. The two sample t-test is not, but I find that people are usually able to manage, and it's up to you. Um, if you have categorical X and categorical Y, that type of data, then you need to use what's called Fisher's exact test. Okay. Um, so Fisher's exact test is going to check the association between these two variables. Now I'm going to go to your Xi book and tell you a little bit about where you can find some details related to this. And by the way, the Fisher's exact test, that is in this assignment on hypothesis testing on 2x2 tables, okay, in which you have this data set, and there's a video lecture um, related to this exact table and the Google Colab for calculating it. I'll point out that Fisher's exact test is best for 2x2 tables, but it can be applied to larger tables as well. Okay, so this is a little bit more on the 2x2 tables. For this first type of analysis, you need to have categorical input and categorical response. Now, in all of these projects, we're interested in determining if the input affects the output. So an example of that could be with a treatment and a control group. So for example, um, maybe it's if a drug is effective. If someone takes a placebo and someone takes the real drug, does that change the outcome, the numerical response Y? So we want to know if input, which is if you took a placebo, no medication, or if you took the medication, changes your outcome of your numerical response. And here your numerical response could be something like maybe tumor size, um, or time until, or excuse me, let's say, um, or your numerical response could be your glucose level, for example. So that would be an example. Okay. Um, in terms of finding data for this, and um, I had thought that this was in this assignment, so I'll move it later, but it's in your final project submission. In terms of finding data, resources for finding data, here are three common resources that you can use. Now, in this project checkpoint one, um, I had mentioned where the material is. So this first one with Fisher's exact test, that's in this quiz. Okay. Um, for the other two, um, it's this bootstrapped compared to populations. Um, I'm going to show you some material that can be useful, and the other one's multiple linear regression. So in terms of your course material, where things lie, okay, for your regression, and regression is this third one, the middle type of analysis. That's in section 12 on regression. Okay. Now you don't need to know this material at this point. You just need to be able to make a graph, state your hypothesis, um, and find your data set. Okay. But this is where the material for regression is. Now, the material for two populations, categorical inputs, um, that material is not fully in this course. Okay. Um, so we do something similar, and I'm asking you to do some additional analysis. What that's called is a test of hypothesis, but not for a single sample, for two samples, okay, or two populations. But this is the material that would relate to it, okay. Then you need to, for your project, you need to be able to um, take it up a notch and understand how to apply it in a little bit of a more complicated setting. Okay, so that's just a little bit more on that. And I want to point out a couple of different things. Just trying to. So regression, tests of hypotheses. Here in this section 10, they talk about the bootstrap, but the application of the bootstrap here is going to be different. This is going to be for a single population. Okay, you'll have to do some additional research or for your project to discover how to do the bootstrap for two samples, and it's a very, very small tweak. Okay, one other thing I'll point out is that sometimes if you have multiple inputs that are categorical, some people choose a categorical input for this second analysis, excuse me, with categorical inputs, but instead of having two categorical inputs, having it be binary, they choose it to be three or more. And that's very rare that people do select that, but it does happen, and it's what interests, you know, the student. So if you're in that situation, that's optional material, and that's right here. Okay, it would be um, what's called an ANOVA. Okay. Okay, so those are just some things for some resources. If you're going to choose one of these last two options here, um, I would strongly discourage you because it's going to require some extra outside work, whereas these other three, while they might not be directly covered in the course, they're very tangential to the material we've already covered. So the regression is directly covered. And the comparing two populations, whether you do that with a, a two sample t-test or you do that with a bootstrap, it's very tangential. Okay. Uh, this categorical um, input and categorical response with Fisher's test, there is material directly on it. Okay. So you're free to make your choices on what you'd like to cover. Then the last thing is, you'll need to find an appropriate data resource. Okay. And so, you know, my favorite is Pi data sets. Um, for illustration, Kaggle actually happens to be um, probably the easiest to find data, even though my personal preference is Pi data sets. But if you're interested in looking through Kaggle and finding some data sets, you can find almost any interesting data set here. Um, so for example, there's this tips data set, and let's see if this one, I think this is just tips. Um, so it looks like I need a sign in. So my apologies. Okay. And now that I've signed in, I guess I get a look at the data sets. Here's a whole bunch of different data sets. And I want you to make it your own. So you should really pick your own data set that you find interesting. Um, so like here's the ones that just come up. I did have someone pick this IMDb data set. That's really beyond what we cover in this class. Like anything related to images, that's a different course. Okay. Um, so let's try and find something, and because I know some of these data sets by hand, by heart. Let's see if I can search. Nope, yeah, it just comes up. Search data sets. Let's look at this book review, and I'm going to, here it provides a preview of some of the columns. So one of the questions I could ask is looking through this because it provides a preview of some of the variables. I could see if the review score, so this is numerical, I could see if the review score or um, the review helpfulness, because those are both numeric, okay, if they affect price, okay, and you can't do much with this text. You have to take a course called Text Analytics to be able to deal with text data, or a machine learning course, which we do offer. So we can't do anything with these variables, but we can do things with numerical ones. So here my input is going to be the review on a numerical scale right here, or the helpfulness, and I want to know, is the review correlated with the price? So I have numerical input, numeric output. To me, that looks like I should be using this linear regression, okay, because of the data types, and I could do my analysis based on that, okay. Now you could make some arguments about the review data type, the score, that it's not really numerical. So if we wanted a different uh, data set, let's look for house prices and see if we can't find a data set. Okay, so it looks like this took us to the data set on house prices. And here let's see if it has the price somewhere in this data set. So here's the sale price. That'll be our Y variable. And I might be interested in knowing if, for example, the and past it, I believe, if the total basement square footage, or somewhere here should be a measurement of total square footage. So let's say if the square footage, um, the greater living area, for example, if the size of the house, which is the living area, affects the price. So that would be numerical response price, numerical input, uh, living area, and I can use regression, and those are truly numeric. Okay, now I don't just have to use one input variable. I could also look at the number of full baths, the number of bedrooms. Those are numerical as well. Um, I could look at variables that are non-numeric. Um, so let's see. I could see if one story or two story houses, for example, sell more, and I'd have to code this as a dummy variable. That topic is in regression, and it should be covered in this multiple linear regression part. Okay. Um, okay. So those are just some examples of um, data analysis that you could use for regression. Now, let's suppose we have categorical, or excuse me, let's go to categorical X and categorical Y, and let's find a data set. So let's go to this housing price data set, and I'm going to choose a different data set, and it's going to be this Titanic data. Okay, so for the Titanic data set, here it tells you if they survived or not, and this is the type of data here is 0, 1, so it is categorical. It's just that males and females are coded as being a 0 or 1. And the same for the sex of the individual, 0 or 1. So typically 0 means false, so that means this person died typically, but you'd have to double check um, the, um, the data dictionary to make sure that's the case. And sex, it's non-specific if the sex is male or female, so we don't know if one is male or one is female. Um, but we can code these as being categories because they are, and this is also how dummy variables work and how you can code it in regression. But I want to point out, survive, that's my response variable. That's categorical. Sex is categorical. So what type of analysis are we doing? We're doing categorical Y, categorical X, Fisher's exact test. Okay, so that's a data set that I could do Fisher's exact test on. Now, I don't have this analysis listed here, but I should, and it is an option. So I could have categorical response and numerical X, and that corresponds to logistic regression. Okay, so in this data set, I could predict categorical survived, and I need numerical X. So I could ask the question, does age affect survival on the Titanic data set? And I could do a logistic regression. That wasn't specifically mentioned as an analysis option, but I'm telling you here that you can do it, and that would be perfectly fine. Let's look at another data set. Um, let's just see what happens if I type in two sample t-test, which you could also do with a um, okay, yeah, the heart disease prediction should be a good one. So let's look at this data dictionary for heart disease. Um, so the response variable 0 is coded as no disease, 1 is coded as disease. So I have categories. Excuse me, this isn't going to be a good one. Um, okay, here's an instance in which we have two variables. So our response is uh, salary, um, and so that is a numerical response, and we want to know if the input of X, which in this case is going to be gender, affects the output. Okay. So in this case, if I want to know if the input of gender affects the outcome of pay, I would be using, excuse me, I'll be using this type of analysis, excuse me, this type of analysis right here, where you can use the bootstrap or a two-sample t-test. Okay, so it all depends both on your data types and what you're calling X and Y, okay, as well as the hypotheses that you're thinking about. Okay, so for this first project, you're just supposed to indicate if you have group members. If you want to work with someone, I encourage you to. Okay, it's really good to have a second set of eyes. The data set you intend to analyze, um, what your variables are, what your input and what your output is, what the data type is to make sure you selected the right type of analysis, and what your purpose of your analysis is. And then finally, how you're going to analyze it. So here, I just want you to upload your relevant graphs. And your relevant graphs, you learn that all the way in sections 1 with descriptive statistics, and more importantly, the graphs are in data exploration, okay, with visualizing things with scatter plots, with um, bar charts, with um, with box plots. Okay, so for these projects, you're going to need, and you will be graded on this, you're going to need to produce the correct type of visualization. So if you're doing regression, your data type is numerical. Numerical, that's a scatter plot. Okay, here your inputs are categorical, numerical. There the visualization is box plots, um, where you're going to display the different inputs for each box plot. So you're going to have one box plot for each input. Here, you're going to have categorical X and categorical Y. You're going to need to do a bar plot, and I'm very particular about this. I'm going to just recommend that you do a conditional probability. So we want to know if the category of the categorical input, which we're going to say is, for example, receiving the drug versus the placebo, if that affects your probability of survival, for instance. Okay. Okay. So that is your